Hey, everybody, it's Doug Green, and I'm the publisher of Technology Reseller News. And I'm very pleased to have with us today Cory O'Daniel, who is the CEO of Massdriver. Cory, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, this is going to be interesting. This is actually directed at our reseller audience. I think Massdriver has a very interesting reseller opportunity, and that's literally what we're going to be learning about today. So, Cory, as we jump into this topic, just tell me a little bit about Massdriver. What is Massdriver?
Yeah, so Massdriver is a visual development environment for managing cloud infrastructure. And so when you look at traditional software teams, you generally have your operations, DevOps, platform engineers that kind of manage the cloud. And then you have your software developers that are building your features, the things that add value and drive business revenue, right? And so what Massdriver does is it kind of sits in between those two teams. It allows your operations engineers to design and apply policies to the cloud in a very composable manner. And then it is a graphical interface for your engineers. So your engineers can literally come in, draw the infrastructure that they want, draw their systems. Now they have this living diagram. And as they draw, it actually builds their cloud environments based off of what they draw, using all of the policies and compliance and security templates that your operations team has set for your organization.
Now, how does all of that benefit the reseller community?
Yeah. So, I mean, for many organizations today, like there is a handful of open source tools that operations engineers kind of have to piece together to get all of this stuff to work well. And it is one of those areas that is struggling to see adoption. So, the infrastructure as code space. Recent surveys have found that it's like 30% penetration across organizations that have actually started to lean into this way of automating and managing the cloud. And the reason the penetration rate is so low is it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do right. And many operations teams are under budgeted and understaffed. And so when they're trying to decide between serving their engineering customers or starting to do automation to make themselves more efficient, many times they have to kind of choose to focus on what the business needs rather than focusing on their own. And so what the interesting opportunity here is there's a big market to tap and people that are trying to adopt infrastructure as code, but they don't have the time to do it. And so if you can get tools in their hands that make it easier for them to automate, easier to apply policies, easier to keep systems secure and compliant, that is a net positive for those operations teams, net positive for those businesses, but it also allows those operations teams to be more efficient. So if you have, 150 software developers, 1,000 software developers, but then you have like 3, 4, 5, 10 people working in operations, you can actually start to get really good yields out of their time because they're not spending most of their days kind of drowning in technical debt.
So, Cory, how does Massdriver simplify the deployment and management of cloud applications?
Yeah, so when you're managing the cloud, there's a lot to do besides just simply like getting the service that you want. Many developers kind of look at the cloud and they say, oh, I need to run a particular database, or maybe I need to run some containers. But to actually get that happening in a secure, compliant, and automatable way requires a ton of tooling. And so you typically have your operations engineers that are writing these policies, writing this code, they're publishing it to, GitHub or whatever. And then your engineers have to go kind of find that stuff, like literally searching through text, searching through GitHub repositories, trying to find the code that they need to be able to build a database. And then they have to copy it, and then they have to paste it, and then they have to keep it up to date. And now you have like 2 copies of this thing. And if you have 3 of that database, 4 of that database, 5 of that database, you can kind of see how this starts to compound and creates a lot of maintenance burden on your operations team and your developers. And so with Massdriver, what we do is, your developers want something from the cloud. Your operations teams want to apply policies and constraints to it. So the way Massdriver works for your operation teams is nothing changes except for the maintenance burden goes away. So you write your code the same way you do today. You use the same tools that you do today. You even put it into GitHub or Azure DevOps or whatever tool you're using for source code management the same way you do today. The difference is once you push it to your Git repository or whatever, it publishes to Massdriver. And now this is where you start to see the real benefit of the platform and how a lot of the maintenance is no longer your burden as operations teams, and how you can kind of unlock the ability for your engineers to move quickly in the cloud. So your engineers would log into the platform. I can go ahead and do a demo of this too. Your engineers would log into the platform, and let's say that they're looking at their current infrastructure, right? So this isn't a diagram that they drew that they hope represents their cloud. This is actual real infrastructure as code managing their cloud environment. So I have a living diagram of how my system works. It makes it really great for onboarding new engineers. If you lose somebody on your team, you don't necessarily lose all the knowledge. You can click on any one of these boxes and come in here and start to manage the infrastructure. But if I'm an engineer and I need maybe a new database, today, I would reach out to the operations team and I'd say, hey, I need maybe MySQL. I can just come into Massdriver and type MySQL, and I might open a ticket in Jira. Now, an operations engineer is going to go off. They're going to build some IAC. They're going to build CI/CD pipelines. I got to copy and paste all this stuff back in once they finally get it done. And with Massdriver, I can come in here. I can search for MySQL. I can see that my team's already built a module for it. I literally just drag it onto the canvas, hit submit. And now I can start managing my own infrastructure. I've got access to this database. I can connect it to the network that my team has given me access to. And right from here, I can click on the resource. I can hit the, I can grab maybe a preset that my operations team has already given to me. So if I don't know how to run this thing in production, I can say, oh, my team's given me a production configuration. That's great. I can select that, come down here, hit deploy, and my infrastructure is provisioning. Now, that was a matter of seconds to get a production MySQL database into a production network, versus the way that we would do this today is two different teams would be working on two different work streams. One is blocked by the other. And I have to reach out to that team, get them to do some work, and then I have to copy and paste stuff into my CI pipelines, into my code base. I have to run it. The operations team has to double check to make sure that I'm applying my security policies and my compliance policies. And what you get with Massdriver is you get this living documentation where I just grab what I want from the cloud. But when I do that, all of my operations team's tooling is getting applied to that request or that use case behind the scenes. So you unlock this ability to have developer self-service, letting developers feel like they have full control over the cloud, but making sure that you're keeping all those operational constraints in place. And now my operations team, they didn't take on a Jira ticket where they went off and worked for a few hours to get me this database. I just did it on my own. So I'm literally just creating more time that my operations team has to go and find ways to add value to the business, whether that is reducing technical debt or building out new systems or focusing on reducing costs.
So, what are some of the specific challenges that Massdriver helps resellers and their clients overcome?
Yeah, so I think for their clients, it is getting their clients the time, right? Every operations team that you meet outside of FANG is drowning in technical debt. They need more time, right? And that is a very hard thing to find, is like, how do you get more bandwidth on these teams? You can always hire more operations engineers, but they're expensive. They're, $180,000 to $300,000 depending on their tenure, right? And so being able to get more efficiency out of operations engineers, network engineers, DevOps, platform engineers is always a boon to any business. And so with Massdriver, what we see is the average operations team gets back 14 hours per week of time, right? And so it just, using the platform on a single person team, it almost feels like you have, an additional 2 weeks of time in your month. And so whether you're early stage or later stage, there's always work for operations to do. They're almost always kind of slowing down the other engineering teams. And if we can get a lot more bandwidth into their hands time-wise, they can unlock a lot more business value.
What about cloud infrastructure? So, what competitive advantages does Massdriver offer to the resellers in the cloud infrastructure market?
Yeah, so the way that our product works is you publish these infrastructure as code modules. So there's a couple of different things that you can kind of benefit from within the platform. So one, it has costs, health, alerting, and monitoring all built into it, right? And so you're getting a tool that makes your team more efficient, but also gives them the full context of the cloud in the same place, right? And so you can also reduce the costs that your customers are seeing because they don't need as many tools to be able to manage their cloud infrastructure. They can get rid of their alerting systems. They can, maybe change the way or reduce the amount of information they're sending to their monitoring systems. But the other way that it's really beneficial is we have a marketplace that sits on top of the platform where you can actually give people access to your different modules. So it allows you to maybe design modules for running ML workloads on Kubernetes, or build ETL pipelines for manipulating data that are going into machine learning models. You can design that once and essentially give access to your customers or sell access to those modules to other organizations. So you can kind of get a network effect out of the work that you're doing.
So, can you share any success stories where Massdriver, as you were saying, 14 hours is a lot, right?
Yeah.
Significantly impacted a customer's cloud strategy.
So we have a customer that's a healthcare telemedicine company, and they were expanding into another couple of countries. They were expecting 100x increase in their traffic during this expansion. And so at the same time, they've been around for 30 plus years. They've got an established engineering team in their organization, but there was only a few people on this team that were doing the DevOps cloud operations work. And so, to be able to scale up and spawn these environments in different countries with different regulations, different compliance, like that's a legal hurdle that an operations engineer now needs to understand to run something in the EU, or maybe run something in Singapore or South Korea or Australia, wherever they're running it, right? And so one of the things that's really nice about Massdriver is you can design these modules once and effectively replicate them. And so if you're running in the United States, and let's say you just need a test environment, you can click a single button and replicate your entire infrastructure to a test environment. Or maybe you want to do disaster recovery. You can replicate that entire environment for a disaster recovery environment. Or if you're spinning up a business in the EU and you need hard isolation because of GDPR, you can design the same system one time, manage it from the same pane of glass, understand the health of it from the same pane of glass, but actually replicate two completely isolated versions of that infrastructure. And for them, this was a huge boon. They didn't have the money nor the time to hire new operations engineers, onboard them, get them up to speed before they were going to be doing these launches in other countries. And so with Massdriver, they're able to bring in their environment and effectively just spawn new versions of it in all these countries where they manage it from one place. And so instead of having an operations team in the EU, an operations team in Asia, they have their single operations team that is now managing essentially clones of their environment all over the globe from a single pane of glass. And that's one of those things that's real beneficial to organizations, but really hard to attain, is getting to that point where, we say this all the time in our industry, like, oh, this person's a 10x engineer. Operations people can be a 10x engineer. They can really do that. They can really be a force multiplier if they're given the budget, the time, and the tools to get there. And many of those teams don't have those.
So, what are the latest trends and challenges you see in the cloud and DevOps industry?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is starting to rein in the complexity. Like, this is, I have my own podcast on platform engineering, and it's funny, the amount of times that the complexity of the cloud comes up is frequent. And when you think about where we started in the cloud, like the cloud came about because data centers were hard, right? We've almost forgotten how hard a data center is because the cloud made it so easy for a while. What started to happen over the past 5-10 years is the cloud used to be this thing that we ran our software on top of. That's easy. But now the cloud is, our software is actually composed of the cloud. My Massdriver, for example, uses 27 different cloud services in itself, like to run itself, not just the network and compute that it runs on top of, right? And so now, as we're starting to bring in all these cloud services into applications, compliance gets more confusing, security gets confusing. Who owns this cloud resource? Is it the operations team? Is it the API team? Is it the e-commerce team, right? Like, the lines start to get really blurry about ownership and governance. And so you see a lot of conversations today talking about, like, how do we simplify the cloud now? Because it was started out simple and it got complex because the goal of AWS, GCP, Azure is not to be easy. It's to be capable. It's to be able to serve every customer that wants to come along and buy cloud and all the different ways that it's packaged. And for an engineer that's new to the cloud, you kind of open the box of AWS and you see 200 different services and you're thinking, okay, how do I piece all this together? When in reality, like you might only need like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those services. So starting to lower or reduce the surface area of the cloud is something you're starting to see in a lot of these platform tools that exist today, similar to Massdriver, some of our competitors, is trying to make the cloud easier to reason about. But that's still not enough, in my opinion. Like having it easier to reason about is one thing, but being able to understand the inventory of all your resources, who owns what, where your costs are, is still another huge challenge. And we see cost tools all over the place. Every year it feels like there's another startup that's offering some way to manage costs in the cloud. And, they all cost $100,000 to get the rights to be able to understand where your costs are. Right. And we've just gotten to this point where everything is so difficult. There's so many moving pieces. It's extremely difficult to reason about. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to solve here is bringing that full context together in a graphical way that anybody can understand. We joke that our sales engineer can even use Massdriver to build out, massive cloud compute systems because he can. Right. And like to be able to have a manager sit down, look at a diagram, understand how your system's laid out, understand where the costs are, seeing that like your staging environment might cost way more money than you think, or that your database is 90% of your cloud spend. Like those are insights that when you just see a line item, it's hard to reason about. But when you see it in the context of the health of your system, the traffic, how utilized your applications are, and then seeing your costs all in one place, it starts to give you a better understanding of how your environment's working holistically.
So, how can we stay on top of this? How can we stay ahead?
Staying ahead's hard because the cloud's moving faster than you are, right? And I think the easiest way to stay ahead is not losing sight of where you are, right? And so the cloud and open source is always kind of teasing the nerd out of software developers, right? We're hobbyists. This is what we do on the weekend, right? Like we sit at work, we program, and then it's 5 o'clock, and guess what? We go out to our garage and we solder some stuff and we program some more, right? Like it's very easy to kind of like nerd snipe us into new technology. And that is something that I feel like you learn as you become a more senior engineer to like kind of just dismiss the new cool thing and focus on what's working. And I think that's the best way for any of us to be able to stay ahead of the cloud is focus on what's working for your business, what's not working for your business, and then start to look for, how could I solve this problem versus saying, oh, AWS launched a new service, we have to use it. Where can we use this, right? And there's a lot of that in our industry, seeing something new, seeing a shiny bauble, and trying to find a problem that it can solve within your org.
Cory, I really want to thank you for joining us today. This has been really interesting. I think it's been an interesting window on some topics that we don't hear enough about. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity. I hope we get to explore more about this reseller opportunity for our readers and watchers. But for now, where can we learn more about Massdriver?
We're at massdriver.cloud. You can find us on LinkedIn as Massdriver, Twitter as well, and GitHub.
All right. Well, Cory, I'm looking forward to our next encounter. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate the time.